Now that we are familiar with the concept of state payoff tables, let us look at a very important application in finance, namely how to think about the difference between debt and equity, and in particular, how to value debt and equity. So the state payoff tables that we have seen, these are going to actually help us to understand the difference between debt and equity. So debt often goes by the name of loan or leverage, and equity often goes by the name of levered ownership or stock, right? So these are terms that are often used interchangeably. Now, the reason why these concepts are important is because in reality, most projects are actually financed with a mixture of loans and equity. So we are already familiar with the notion of loans or debt, and we have been studying it for a few weeks now. So what is equity? That is perhaps a new term. So essentially, equity is what goes to the business owner after the debt is paid off, right? So this is the residual claimant, basically, after all the obligations related to the projects are paid off, right? So suppose we want to answer the following question. There is a project which was financed by a combination of loans and residual ownership. Now, suppose that the project fails. What must be the appropriate compensation for the person who gave the loan versus how much money should be going to the equity holder, right? This is an important question in finance. And this basically involves splitting the net present value streams into two components, debt and equity, and how do you go about doing this is something that is useful to see, right? And the concept of state payoff tables that we have actually come up with, that's going to help us to answer this question. So how do we use this concept of state payoff tables? So let's recall the example that we just studied right now, where we were determining the value of building, which depended on a particular state of the world occurring, right? Whether it was a bad state or a good state. And we actually saw how do we go about calculating the present value of the different state contingent payoffs. So payoffs which are dependent on basically either the bad state happening or the good state happening, right? So building basically was an example of what is known as a state contingent claim, right? So what that means is that the payoff or the value of the building depends on which particular state of the world actually realized, right? And this is something now, hopefully, we are very comfortable working with and also valuing it, right? Now, the interesting thing to note is that you can actually use the payoff table that we worked with to work out the value of any state contingent claims, not just buildings, right? And the key insight is that the debt and equity can be thought of as state contingent claims as well, right? So in order to see how this works, let's take an example. And this is basically a continuation of this building example that we have been looking at, right? So remember that the building had a cost of like 75,000. And in the previous case, we had seen an example of somebody who was putting in one's own money of this 75,000, and then we calculated what are the rates of return and so on, right? But now imagine that this person, instead of putting in all completely one's own money, actually took out a loan worth 70,000 to finance this purchase, and then decided to put in the remaining 5,000 out of one's own pocket, right? So what this effectively means is that one single project, which was building, now effectively has become two different projects, right? Each of which is owned by a different party. So you have got the first project, which is this mortgage lending or the loan that has been extended, right? This 70,000 worth of loan. And you can imagine that the bank who has given this loan is the owner of this project, right? The second project is basically this residual building ownership, right? So think about this as the person who has taken out this 70,000 loan, but has given in this 5,000 remaining amount. So this is basically the person who owns the building, but also has the obligation to repay the loan, right? So what that means is that the investor who is this residual building ownership, basically the equity investor, is not going to receive any money from this project till the loan has been completely repaid, right? And so this is an example of basically equity in the building. Now, what we want to do is basically figure out a way of valuing these two ownerships, right? And also figure out a way of what are the expected rate of returns from these different projects, right? So let's first think about the problem from the perspective of the creditor who has given the loan. So one question is that what's the appropriate promised interest rate that should go to this creditor, right? So in order to answer this question, we actually need to know what is going to happen if the building turns out to be worth less than the amount promised, right? So let's consider the example that we had done before. So suppose that the bad state of the world occurs and the building is worth 60,000. Now, remember that the person who had given the loan had put in 70,000 worth of money. So if it is worth 60,000, definitely it's worth less than the value of the loan, right? And because the person who has given the loan, basically the debt owner, has first priority, then that means that the creditor can actually appropriate this amount. So the 60,000 units worth of amount in the bad state, right? Assuming that this is less than the promised amount. However, we are going to assume that this is the only thing that the creditor can appropriate, right? So in particular, the creditor cannot appropriate any other assets of the person who had taken the money, right? So this type of loan is what is known as a no recourse loan. And this type of arrangement is actually what is known as limited liability. Now, you might have heard of this term before, and this is a very important financial arrangement that is considered like one of the building blocks of modern capitalism, right? So another example of limited liability is, for instance, if you buy a stock in a company and the company does not do well, then the maximum amount of money that you can lose is the amount of money corresponding to what you have put in terms of the stock, buying the stock, right? You cannot be held responsible for the failure of the company by asking you to kind of like pay for that in addition to what you have put in the stock, right? So that is like one of the reasons why actually people started kind of like invest in this sort of companies as opposed to buying partnerships where you would be held for more liable than the amount of money that you have put in, right? And this is one of the reasons why actually corporations became an important part in the modern economy, right? Okay, so let's now think about what's the present value of the mortgage lending. So from the creditor's perspective. Now, we can actually draw the creditor's payoff table, right? So as before, the states are bad and good, and we know the probabilities of these two different states, 1/4 and 3/4. We also know that in the bad state, when the value of the house is 60,000, then the creditor has the full right to this 60,000, right? However, what we do not know is that what should be the promised amount going to the creditor if the state is good, right? The other thing that we know is that the relevant discount factor is given by, as before, 1/1 plus 20% in both the cases, right? So how do we go about calculating what's this promised amount? Well, remember that in terms of present value, the amount that the creditor had put in is 70,000, right? So we do know that what's the present value of the project in terms of these values that are given to us, right? So so if the present value is 70,000, we know that in the bad state, this amount is going to be 60,000. We know the discount factor, right? So therefore, in the bad state, this is the relevant numbers, right? 1/4, which is the probability of the bad state, multiplied by 60,000, which is the amount that is going to go to the creditor, divided by 1 plus 20%. And in the good state, which happens with probability 3/4, the creditor should be paid an amount given by promise. And again, the discount rate is 20%, right? So you can actually solve this equation for the variable promise, which is the only thing that is unknown here. So this is basically a linear equation, right, in one unknown. And if you solve it, then you can show that this is going to be equal to 92,000, right? So what this means is that basically in the good state, when the house is worth 100,000, then 92,000 of this should be actually going to the bank, right? This is what you require in order, basically, you will see for the present value to be calculated in this manner, right? Okay, let's understand it from another perspective. So if you have a promise payoff of 92,000, then the lender's rate of return in the good state is going to be equal to 92,000 minus 70,000. Remember, this is the amount that the bank has, for example, put in this project, divided by 70,000. So the rate of return is basically 31.4% in the good state. In the bad state, this project is going to be worth 60,000 from the bank's perspective. And so therefore, the rate of return is 60,000 minus 70,000 divided by 70,000, or minus 14.3%. Now, if you weigh this rate of returns with the probability of these different states occurring, you can see that this is exactly equal to 20%, right? And in fact, this is exactly how we had actually calculated the number 92,000, so that as a result of calculating this expected return, based on this 92,000, you end up with exactly a rate of return equal to 20%, right? Why 20%? Because remember, in our risk neutral perfect market, anyone investing for 1 year expects to earn the same expected rate of return of 20%, right? So this 92,000 is exactly that amount which has to be given to the banker, right? So that the expected return becomes 20,000, right? If you give any amount less than 92,000, then the lender's expected rate of return is going to become less than 20%, and hence the lender would not be interested in extending this loan, right? So that's how we can pin down this 92,000, right? Okay, so that's from the lender's perspective. What about the rate of return from the equity owner's perspective? Well, we already know the answer to this as well, right? Because we are in this perfect market scenario, the equity owner would also actually, and residual, then the equity owner would end up also getting 20%. But let's look at the calculations, right? So remember, the building is worth 75,000 today. A loan of 70,000 was taken. So therefore, the equity owner had to put in an investment of 5,000, right? So this is the cost today, right? Now, the equity owner promises to pay the creditor 92,000 next year. This is what we had just calculated. In the bad state, the lender confiscates the house and the equity owner ends up getting nothing. In the good state, the building is going to be worth 100,000. The promise to the lender of 92,000 is therefore going to be actually carried out. And so therefore, the equity owner is going to get the remaining amount. So this is 100,000 minus 92,000 or 8,000, right? So we can put all these numbers in the payoff table for the equity owner as well. So again, you have got these two states, bad and good. Probability of bad is 1/4. Probability of good is 3/4. If it is a bad state, then the value of the building to the equity owner is worth 0, because the entire amount, 60,000, will be taken over by the lender. And if the state is good, then the value of this building is worth 8,000, because out of the actual value of the house, which is 100,000, 92,000 is going to go to the lender, right? So only the remaining amount, which is this 8,000, is going to be with the equity owner, and the discount factor is as before. And so therefore, we can calculate what's the expected equity owner's payoff. So this is 1/4 times 0 plus 3/4 times 8,000 or 6,000. And once you kind of like discount it with the 20%, you end up getting that the present value is equal to 5,000, which is exactly the amount that this person had put in, right? Okay. We can also calculate the rate of return in the different states. So in the good state, the rate of return is 8,000 minus 5,000 divided by 5,000 or 60%. In the bad state, the rate of return is going to be exactly minus 100%. And so therefore, the equity owner's expected rate of return is going to equal 1/4 times minus 100% plus 3/4 times 60%, or equal to 20%, right? So remember, this is the number that we had already kind of like predicted before. But it's good to see the decomposition of the rate of returns depending on the different states, right? Okay, so interestingly, you can kind of like pull in all this information that we have had discussed so far in one table. So you have here basically the states, which are the bad and the good, and this happens with probability 1/4 and 3/4. We know that's the building value of the different states. So it's 60,000 and 100,000. And we know how this is divided into the amount that is going to the person who had extended the loan, right? So this whole 60,000 is going to go to that creditor in the bad state, and the equity owner gets nothing. And out of the 100,000, 92,000 is going to go to the creditor, and 8,000 is going to go to the equity holder, right? So based on these numbers, we can calculate what's the expected value at time 1. So the expected value of the whole building is going to be equal to 90,000, and the expected value of the mortgage is going to be equal to 84,000. So we again get that by 1/4 into 60,000 plus 3/4 into 92,000. And from there, we can also calculate the equity, the expected value of the equity, which is basically 6,000, right? So you can notice again that this 90 can be split up into 84 plus 6, corresponding to the amount going to the mortgage holder and the amount that is going to the equity holder, right? Based on all this, we can also calculate what's the present value at time zero. So this is equal to 75,000 for the whole building. And again, we can split this off into the mortgage holder basically getting the 70,000, and then the equity holder is corresponding amount is 5,000, right? And we also notice that the expected return is the same for all these three projects, and that's equal to 20%, right? So this is the main advantage of the payoff table, right? You can put in all these numbers together, and you can also see how these different kind of like projects are kind of like related to each other, right? And this is an important point because if you think about it, there are actually three possible investment opportunities that is described in this table, right? So one, you have this from the perspective of a creditor. So think of it as a bank, which is loaning money, right? In exchange for a promised payment, right? So this promised payment here was this 92,000, which may or may not be met depending on what the state of the world is. In the second case, you have got this levered building or the equity owner, right, who is basically taking out this loan and basically is obliged to pay back whatever is possible of this loan and only gets to keep the leftover after whatever obligations have been made have been kept or not, right? So, for example, if the promise is to pay 92,000, and of course, if the bad state happens, then you do not have 92,000 to pay over, right? You have only got 60,000 to pay over, but all that money is going to go to the paying back the loan, right? And so therefore, the equity holder gets the surplus, which here in this case is zero. However, in the good state, the promise to pay back the loan of 92,000 is going to be respected, right? Because you have enough money to do that. And so therefore, the equity owner gets to keep the remaining surplus, which is 8,000, right? You could have also had a third possible investment opportunity, which is to kind of like take up the whole project without actually taking out the loan, right? So this is actually this original project of this building value that we have discussed. And this can actually be got as well by combining both the mortgage and the equity part, right? So we already have the numbers for that. And the key thing to understand, and this is where the connection with our earlier discussions come in, is that you can think of all of these three investments as state contingent claims, right? In the sense that how much are these investments or projects worth depends on what the state of the world is, right? Okay, so one question that you can actually answer now on the basis of all of this discussion is to actually answer this question that among these three investments, full ownership, loan ownership, or equity ownership, which investment is riskiest, right? So let's go back and think about the numbers. So you've got equity, which in the bad state, which happens with probability 1/4, loses everything. So therefore, the rate of return is minus 100%. However, in the good state, which happens with probability 3/4, it earns 60%, right? So it earns, actually, you'll see the highest amount, but it also loses the highest. Debt, on the other hand, loses minus 14.3% with 1/4 probability. So this is the bad state, right? Where it gets 60,000, whereas it had put in 70,000. So that's where you get the minus 14.3%. However, in the good state, it is going to earn 31.4%, right? So this is corresponding to, again, putting in 70,000 to get 92,000, right? And this happens with 3/4 probability. The full ownership, on the other hand, basically, this is the case where you take up the building project without taking any loans. This loses 20% if you have got 1/4 probability with the basically the bad state. However, it earns 33.3% with a probability 3/4, right? So if you calculate the expected return in all these cases, the answer is going to be the same. This is 20%, but you can look at the different spreads. And what if you stare at the numbers, you can observe that basically the loan is the least risky among these three options, followed by full ownership, and the most riskiest option among these three is equity ownership, right? So what basically is going on is that by taking the loan, you have got a medium risky project, which was this building project. That has been split into two components. One is a more risky project compared to the building project. This is the equity. And you have got one which is a less risky project, which is mortgage, right? So this combined project which combines this equity and mortgage is of an intermediate risk compared to these two different things, right? You can also represent the same thing through this diagram. So this is basically looking at what are the rates of the return of these different three different projects, right? And all of the three different ones have the same expected rate of return, right? So 20%. So they are centered at the same value. However, debt has basically the least spread, right? So this is just plotting this minus 14.3 and 31.4 here. We have got in full ownership having a medium risky, and the most highest spread is coming from this equity, right? Which is therefore the most risky thing, right? However, again, because we are living in this risk neutral perfect world, all of the three projects end up earning the same rate of return, which is this 20%, right? Remember, this is basically the same rate of return has to be earned by everyone. So this is, again, a consequence of assuming that the investors are risk neutral, and that basically leads to the risk premium being equal to zero, right? So what it means is that doesn't matter what the risk of each of these projects are, as long as they offer an expected rate of return of 20%, investors are going to be willing to take up these investments, right? Regardless of whatever is the risk attached, right? If instead we had investors being risk averse, so this is a term we'll see in more details later on, but basically it means that you have got investors who do not like risk, and so therefore, for example, they would not take up a fair bet. Debt would end up having to offer the lowest expected rate of return compared to the unlevered project, right? Which again would offer a lower expected rate of return compared to equity, right? So basically, if you're risk averse, then more risk has to be compensated with a higher expected rate of return, right? But this is something that we'll discuss in more details later on. Okay, so why did we kind of like spend so much time thinking about debt and equity? The reason is because almost all the projects that you consider in real world are financed by a combination of debt and equity, right? So just to give you an example, if you are thinking of stocks that are purchased or traded in stock markets, these are nothing but examples of equity that actually provides money, right? So in the sense of dividends, let us say, these dividends are kind of like paid are out of something that is basically the residual that is left over after paying back liabilities, right? And what we did in through this extended example is to think about how to compute state contingent promised and expected payoffs, as well as how to compute state contingent promised and expected rates of returns through this simple example. And these are necessary tools to actually kind of like work with debt, equity, and all this other kind of like different types of state contingent loans claims that you might see in future. So very simple setting, but I think an important starting point to thinking about a lot of these issues.